Next up, we've got a panel that is a direct result of discussions that came out from our Ideas Summit in Detroit earlier this year, where we heard from New Deal leaders, we heard from partners that you wanted to dig deeper into affordable housing. So that's going to be our next discussion. I want to welcome up our next panel with Dave Williams is going to moderate. He serves on the board of directors at Up for Growth, a national cross-sector member network committed to solving the housing shortage. Vice President of Lafayette Square, a nationwide impact investment platform. So we ask just everybody if you could please take your seats or take your conversation out into the hallway, and we're going to bring up our next panel.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay, one more time. Good morning.
Good morning.
Do we have to do selfies again? Are we going to do selfies? Okay, we'll just think, okay. Thank you for having us. My name is David Williams. Again, I'm at Lafayette Square. We're a national investment firm focused on providing capital in underserved and overlooked communities. And I'm joined by Zach Conine, who is the treasurer of the state of Nevada, and Lily Goldsmith, who is the VP of Social Impact Investing at JPB here in DC. And we're talking about affordable housing. So I think kind of my goal for today is to hit on a few issues. Very exciting that this issue came up in Detroit. I worked in the Detroit mayor's office. I'm from Detroit, so kind of glad to hear that good ideas and collaboration is coming out of my hometown. But the goal for today is to kind of talk about what is the problem, what are ways that we can incentivize more affordable housing, how are investment decisions made, and to really kind of have a dialogue about innovative things happening in the field and what are your concerns as policymakers from across the country. So I'll kind of kick things off with a few kind of comments and framing ideas from my experience and expertise, and then I'll have Zach and Lily introduce themselves, talk about their work and kind of how it applies to this issue in general. So kind of my background, I'm an affordable housing attorney by trade, so I was helping developers build affordable housing using tax credits and other mechanisms. I moved back to my hometown of Detroit to help kind of use that tool set to kind of help rebuild our city. I worked for the mayor, Mayor Duggan, our economic development team, oversaw our commercial real estate portfolio, and was really focused on neighborhood revitalization issues, kind of really helping rebuild the physical infrastructure of the city, because it was right when we were entering into and then thankfully exiting out of bankruptcy. So kind of a Wild West time, but one where there's a lot of space to think creatively around a lot of these issues. I took some of those local experiences nationally and helped build out the public policy arm of a think tank called Opportunity Insights based at Harvard, where we're using big data to study issues of economic opportunity and mobility. And from there worked on some both public sector and private models focused on helping lower income families access opportunity through the housing market. As mentioned, I'm on the board of Up for Growth, and I think we kind of serve as what I think of as the leading pro-housing organization in the country. When we think about affordable housing, I think it's important to take a step back and understand that at the root of it, right, there's a housing supply issue. Right, there are, and it's a really great report, the Housing Underproduction Report, available at upforgrowth.org. There are 4 million fewer units of housing than we need across this country. Right, so they're kind of, given how many people live in this country, to actually house everyone sufficiently, we would need to build 4 million more units, and that underproduction has been getting worse over the past 10 years. 83% of markets across the country have this worse underproduction number happening. And it's kind of spreading from kind of the traditional urban markets that you kind of expect to have these underproduction numbers, moving into the suburbs and to rural areas. So it's really an issue impacting everyone across the country. I think it's really important to understand that that supply issue is really underlying, I think, the affordability crisis that we're facing as a nation. As we think about, when I sit in my investor seat, I think important to understand is that, right, building new housing is a very capital-intensive practice. And when we're trying to build new housing or invest in housing, we're typically raising money from third-party investors, right? Pension funds, insurance companies, right? Groups who are looking to figure out how to secure their capital and invest in ways to grow their portfolios. And when we're trying to build new housing and raise money for that housing, right, we're raising money from folks who are looking at other opportunities. So we have to make sure that we can provide the actual returns that are competitive with other investment sources. So I think that's oftentimes a constraint, is that we have to be able to build in ways that can kind of provide returns for developers, but also provide attractive and competitive returns for investors. And if we're trying to build affordable housing and subsidized housing, we usually have to find sources of subsidy that can kind of replace those returns for investors. Working in Detroit, something that we focused on was we had a very weak market, 50 years of decline of the city, a market where it didn't make sense for market rate developers to come into the city and develop. So what we did was we had to create a citywide strategy, leveraging sources like the low-income housing tax credit, new market tax credits, other sources coming from the federal government and state government, and really focusing on target neighborhoods where we could provide certainty to developers that if they were building, if they were creating new housing, there would be support for them, kind of helping de-risk their investments and their activities in our city, kind of bringing a really holistic approach to that kind of work. And then lastly, one example, a group I work with called High Opportunity Neighborhood Partners, thinking beyond just developing new housing, but how do you create new affordable housing using current government programs and subsidies. Our model was buying single-family homes in suburbs that had good schools, low crime, places where a lot of the research from my think tank focused on how these places can really kind of create long-term benefits for kids and families, and then renting those homes exclusively to families who are using Section 8 vouchers, right? Families who oftentimes have a very difficult time using this really great resource and not being able to find housing because of discrimination in the market or other issues. And so that was enabled by a policy called Small Area Fair Market Rent, a HUD program that basically determines that certain regions have to provide their subsidies in ways that they can actually afford the rental rates in higher cost areas. So basically an effort to deconcentrate poverty and help families that use Section 8 vouchers to move to some of these higher opportunity places. And this model was focused specifically on, proactively buying these homes so that these families didn't have to jump through hoops and find private landlords who didn't want to rent to Section 8 families, but was actually kind of encouraging them to move into these homes, into these areas of opportunity. So again, kind of thinking about supply as an underarching or overarching issue when it comes to affordability, and thinking through the innovative models that we can apply both from the public side and the private side to create more affordable housing within our communities. So Zach, would love to kind of hear about your background, what you're up to now, and kind of how that applies to this space.
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Zach Conine. I have the pleasure of being the 23rd treasurer of the great state of Nevada. And you might be wondering why a treasurer would care this much about housing. And because we've found that housing is fundamental to every other problem we're trying to solve. That other problems end up being symptoms of a poor housing situation. Early childhood education. If a student is housing insecure, how are they going to focus on paying attention in class? Food insecurity. If a family is housing insecure and moving from place to place, getting access to those resources gets harder and harder. Economic development. Who's going to go start a business if they're not sure where they're going to sleep at night, right? We believe in Nevada that housing, access to affordable housing is a human right. And so we start from that place. And supply is the problem. There is not enough housing. That $4 million number for the number of units that are missing, right? At the average cost of building a door, and I mean the cheapest door, that's $1 trillion problem, right? When you start getting into the cost of development in some of our major urban cores, it gets much, much more expensive. When you start getting into the cost of development in more rural parts of the country where the issue isn't necessarily building the house, it's that the house will be so far away from services that it is not affordable, even if the house is affordable, because you need a car to live there, because you got to pay for Starlink to get access to the internet, because your school, if it exists, is an hour away. Housing is fundamental to the work that all of you are trying to do, whatever that work is. And so our focus in Nevada has been that. Our focus has been on how do we increase supply both from private dollars, from public dollars, from trying to be as clever as possible. Because, and this is, I think, a bit of a downside for everybody in this room, you are all competing for the same money to build housing. You are all competing for the same private dollars, for the same pension dollars, for those insurance dollars that you spoke of. All of those dollars are looking for the best deal, and sometimes the best deal is the highest return, and sometimes the best deal is the less bullshit, right? And so, especially from a local government perspective, you've got to figure out how are we removing friction in this process, because there are other communities that are removing friction in this process. And if you do not remove the friction, the money will move, because it's relatively fungible. I think the other thing that we spend just a ton of time thinking about, right, is how to make sure that while we're building housing, we don't allow ourselves to miss kind of the forest for the trees, right? And this is a zoning question, and I'm not in local government, I'm in finance, so I get to just talk about zoning in a real conceptual, wouldn't it be nice sense, but we probably shouldn't have a lot of it, right? In case study after case study after case study, when we have removed single-family zoning from areas, where we have removed, in some cases, all zoning from areas, right? We have increased housing supply or decreased the inflationary rate. Auckland, right, which I'm sure everybody looks at from a housing perspective all the time, but Auckland removed all zoning in 2016. While every local market around them went up by about 25% in the cost of housing since then, they haven't moved at all. Minneapolis has done great work in this space. And so looking for ways, sometimes you hear, and you will always get this in the public comment, right? We got to preserve the character of the neighborhood, right? We got to preserve the character of the neighborhood. I think people need to sleep inside. And so being able to keep pushing back on that narrative and knowing that not only are you doing it because it's the right thing to do from a morality perspective, but because it's the right thing to do from a capital perspective, because you will be able to attract new capital in, I think is something that's real important. And so from a Treasury perspective, we care about it in Nevada because functionally in Nevada and a lot of other states, housing insecurity is economic insecurity. We don't have a state income tax in Nevada. We have all of you coming in and playing slot machines, which you should do. There's plenty of direct flights from DC, just something to think about. But we don't have a state income tax. And so we need people to consume. We need people to gamble. We need people to buy things. We need people to go to shows, see Taylor Swift, right? We need things like that in order to be effective from a government perspective. And when folks don't have a place to live, they don't do that. And so it's central in our mission. And I'm excited to be here to talk about it. Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zach. Willie?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I'm Lily Goldstein. It happens a lot, surprisingly, the Smith and the Steen. Oh, no, it's okay. And surprisingly, not the G of JBG Smith, unfortunately. But I'm happy to be here. So JBG Smith, for those of you that don't know, is a Maryland-based REIT. We're traded on the New York Stock Exchange. We have about 15 million square feet of high-quality office, multifamily, and retail in high-growth, high-barrier to entry submarkets in and around the DC metro area. So we're pretty exclusively focused here. And I sit on the impact investing platform that was recently rebranded as Leo Impact Capital. And one of the mechanisms through which we make impact investments is through the impact pool, which is a $115 million third-party capitals, as you mentioned, raised fund that provides financing for the creation and preservation of affordable workforce housing. So we focus primarily on middle income earners, 60 to 120% AMI, area median income, in this market. And they're the teachers, nurses, firefighters, those that are really essential to our communities and make our communities run. So through our impact pool, we've preserved a little over 2,800 units to date. We've deployed about 65% of our capital so far. And we focus primarily in the NOAA preservation space. So that's naturally occurring affordable housing. So it's stock that exists today, but is traditionally affordable because of its vintage, because it has sort of lack of amenities, but is well located. And we often look at opportunity insights, and so we focus our investments in high impact neighborhoods. So areas that are amenity rich, retail rich, good schools, low poverty, low crime rate. And want to give children the best possible outcome. And so we are looking at existing Class B and C apartment buildings in those areas to preserve the affordability and actually create committed affordability by putting covenants in place. So we work either with nonprofit organizations where we provide mezzanine financing so that 100% of the ownership is in nonprofit hands, or in jurisdictions or in certain transactions where nonprofit ownership doesn't really necessarily carry a tax benefit, we'll provide equity investments as well. So we have 2 equity deals, and the balance are loans that we provided to affordable housing nonprofits. And a lot of what was mentioned today, I think, is really important in sort of how and why we focus on this area. So about 10 plus or minus years ago, JBG Smith were one of the larger landowners in the area. We have 15 million square feet of existing multifamily office and retail. We have 9.8 million square feet of development pipeline, most of which is multifamily. We own and manage 13,000 apartment units. And so we're a really significant player in this area, but our senior leadership looked around and said, that's great, but who can afford to continue to live here, sort of besides the top of us? And really recognize that it was really an economic driver is housing stability and housing security. And so they started working with other leaders in the area. We partnered with the Federal City Council, which is based here in the district, that focuses on sort of the betterment of the district and focuses on significant policy changes, transportation, water, housing being one of them. Partnered with them and launched this platform about 5 years ago. So we then raised this fund through which we've, as I mentioned, have 2,800 units in just over 3 years, because it really speaks to the need and also the availability. So the 4 million units that we need to build in order to be sort of more housing secure across the country, we will always be falling behind if we don't include preservation in the mix. Someone described it as holding a bag of rice and cutting out the bottom and saying, well, we'll just throw more rice in. That's never going to solve the problem. And preservation is not only a key part of the solution, but it is also, to the point you were making about capital, it's an alternative place to spend capital, especially as a private player in the field. We do work with local jurisdictions on tax abatements, on right of first refusal, on pilot programs, payment in lieu of taxes, what have you. We work obviously across multiple jurisdictions here, but we don't require public investment. And we sort of said, where's our expertise? It's in owning, managing, and operating apartment buildings. And so why shouldn't we invest in this space? And there are a lot of incredible sort of capital A affordable housing providers in our region. We're very lucky for that, that are using tax credit programs to develop new units. But there really was no private capital going to this workforce space. And we said we can make a return for our investors, albeit at a slightly below market return, although there's sort of what is a market return in an environment like today. But we can really raise private capital. Our primary investors are financial institutions seeking community reinvestment at credit. And sort of let what I call take out some of the lower hanging fruit, take out this stock that is not committed affordability, is at risk of losing these units sort of going out of market, being acquired by value-add investors who will increase the rents. Grab those units. We've proven we can do it, and let the public funding, the more difficult to secure deals, be focused on those that are more deeply affordable and more in need. So we're really excited about sort of how we've been able to accomplish this, and really hope that we're able to sort of get that story out there, because it's not unique to DC. And so other real estate developers, other players in each of your jurisdictions and regions can really enter into this space.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And could you speak a little more to, I think, with your investor base and your fund, how you really do balance the kind of the social impact that I think folks are looking for with the returns needed? Because I think that is always a question. Again, how do you scale initiatives like this, and how could this apply for other communities as well?
Yeah, so so like I mentioned, our primary investment is through mezzanine financing. So subordinate to the first mortgage, we typically work with Fannie or Freddie. Both of the agencies have sort of approved the structure. And so those investments are sort of easier to talk about from a return perspective because it's essentially fixed rate debt. And we target a 7% return to our investors. Many of our investments actually are also tax-free because we place tax-exempt bond financing once we reach our required committed affordability metrics. So yes, it's lower, but it's not 2%. It's still a healthy return. And pension funds, insurance companies are huge sources of capital, but also financial institutions are required to invest. And as we just saw with the new ruling that came out for CRA qualifications, which we're still digging through the 1,600-page piece of legislation, really talks about innovative financing. And there is actually additional credit sort of going outside of the low-income housing tax credit program, the new markets tax credit program, historic preservation, and looking at alternative ways of financing. And so we've been really lucky to work with some of our bank partners to make these investments.
Yeah. No, it's always interesting to see those public-private interplays and kind of what different types of programs, sometimes those more deeply affordable programs that I think are more traditional, but also with your new structures, you're innovating in how the public can also play in those as well.
Yeah, and so, and you mentioned money is fungible, and we can sort of talk about this later and sort of how policies across, especially sort of a tri-state, although we call ourselves a tri-state region. Obviously, one of those states is not actually a state, but how different policies affect where you want to invest your money. But broadly speaking, we are very fortunate to be able to work with great public sector partners. We just closed a deal in Montgomery County that reduces our property taxes by 50% for a minimum of 51% of our units at 65% of area median income or below. And so there are a lot of opportunities to sort of work with the local partners to make sure that if they're able to invest and buy down more affordability, we're happy to have the money and we're happy to have additional affordability.
Yeah, 100%.
I think your point about preservation is so important. And you'll have not just the units that you're talking about, right, that are sort of naturally occurring affordable units, but you'll have other units that originally got tax credits to be built as big A affordable, sort of restricted 60% AMI, area median income. Everybody kind of functionally in this room knows how that structure works, right? Seeing some nods. Okay. But to get those low-income tax equity credits, sometimes those properties fall out of affordability because no one's looking at it, right? When we got there a couple of years ago, there wasn't a list at the state of which projects around the state were originally supported by those tax credits. And so some would just age out, right? Because originally, for most projects, if they're old enough, they were 15 years, some were 20 years. And so they were affordable for 20 years, and then they aged out of the program and immediately went to market rate. Right? And so you've lost that affordability stock. And from a cost per door perspective, it is so much more expensive to build new. From a zoning perspective, you don't have a zoning fight. It's already affordable. The neighbors are already comfortable with it being affordable. It's always been affordable. And so making sure that your state or your local government has a good list of those projects and when they're going to fall off is a very easy thing to implement. But it can save you hundreds of doors on a calendar basis that would just effectively age out of the process.
And to that point, also specifically for year 15 low-income housing tax credit expiring deals, to keep them in the tax credit program, you have to recommit a ton of capital. These buildings are 15 years old. They are fine. We're investing in a lot of buildings that were built in the 40s and 50s. This is good quality construction. And so and I hate to speak negatively of the tax credit program because I think it has done incredible work to create and preserve affordable housing across our country, but then you have to put additional dollars in where it's not needed just to keep it in the tax credit program. And so to look at private partners to continue on that affordability is a much better solution and a much more efficient use of the public tax credit dollars.
100%. I think it's such an important point that, right, these things can just fall away. And like just by taking stock of these portfolios, kind of understanding when they're expiring, like that first step is actually a very important one that is not happening across the country. I think oftentimes we assume that there must be someone watching out for all this. There oftentimes isn't. So I think that's one, I think, very helpful example of kind of how we can all be proactive on this front. You know, when you opened, you mentioned that, you know, typically you don't see state treasurers on panels about affordable housing. So I was kind of curious, you know, what
Typically
what
you don't
levels-
see state treasurers on panels. I think that's
fair enough.
Let's start with the treasurer, just anonymous nature.
Also
we
very
need to
good
find
Also, we're clearly not the AI panel because we all like have paper here. You actually have the phones, but yeah.
Yeah, no, we're old school. That's okay.
Still old school.
But I was curious, so what levers are you able to pull from your perch that kind of really can have an impact in this space, and kind of how can we all think creatively around kind of our positioning and how we can be active in the affordable housing space?
I appreciate that. I think the first thing to look at is the programs that are already available from the federal government that your state or local community might not be taking full advantage of, right? So private activity bonds issued by HUD come into your state. They can be used for a number of things, but one of the things they can be used for is affordable housing tax credits through conduit bond issuances. And we could talk about conduit bond issuances, but I'm losing people already, so we're not going to do that. But the point is there is money in your state that can be used for affordable housing, both creation of new affordable housing or preservation of affordable housing. And a lot of states send that money back. Right? And sometimes they send that money back because there isn't a project that sort of meets the Venn diagram of should do it and how the program works. But in a lot of cases, they send it back because they're not actively trying to find developers. And so one of the routes that we've been able to take in the Treasury, but other folks have been able to take, is simply going out and looking for developers to do affordable housing in other states who are not doing affordable housing in your state and asking them why. Are they not doing it because the juice isn't worth the squeeze? Are they not doing it because there's some sort of local zoning issue? Did they have a problem with the clerk at a planning commission 17 years ago? I mean, it's problems like that, right? As we all know, sometimes government is just a little bit goofy. And figuring out ways to remove those frictions is a really easy thing to do. And it doesn't require, you don't need statutory authority. You don't need sort of the joke about treasurers, right, is nobody actually knows what we do. But the good thing about treasurers, if nobody knows what you do, nobody knows what you don't do. And so you can lean into these things and ask questions. And often those questions, you find the friction points are really small. Right? So we've used private activity bond cap a lot. A lot of you had access to or saw a massive amount of money come in from the federal government through ARPA. Some of that's still floating around, right? We were able to use in Nevada, we've received about $2.7 billion in direct funding. I don't know if anyone's ever gotten a wire for $2.7 billion. It's a very strange thing. You get the notice on your phone. You're like, and of course, because it's federal treasury, they sent it to us Friday at 12:15. If anyone's a bond investor, you know what a problem that is. But anyway, we kept it. But that 2.7, we were able to put about $500 million of it into affordable housing. And one of the ways that we were able to do that is we asked housing developers in the state already, housing developers that weren't in the state already, people who are at all kind of levels of affordable housing, because we're talking about affordable sort of big A, typically 60% or less, right? Mm-hmm. Workforce housing, typically 120% of area median income or less. But there's also things that government is almost always going to need to be involved in, like supportive housing. Right? Assisted living housing, housing where the math doesn't work, at least in no model I've ever seen. But the math doesn't work for a private investor, but can work with a little bit of government help. And we were able to take $500 million of that 2.7 and put it towards the creation of new housing, right? Great. The subsidizing of housing that had become less, sort of had moved out of the band of possibility because of inflation. Right, so as lumber costs were going all goofy, right, to try and keep that steady. And then in preservation. And Preservation locally, another thing you can think about is age-in-place preservation. So you might have an individual in a home and they can afford that home, but that home is 2 stories and they're getting a little bit older and it's hard for them to go upstairs, right? Or the addition, I mean, it's so simple, but the addition of sturdy ADA-accessible rails and ramps into older housing is a great way to keep that housing stable and allow people to age in place. And when people can age in place, it helps with the transition, right? The generational wealth transition, because they don't have to sell the home that they've lived in their whole life in order to pay for an assisted living facility. And if they don't have to sell the home, they're able to give it to their kids. And when they're able to give it to the kids, housing is one of the largest sources of generational wealth in the country. Which is why things like redlining have been so destructive to populations. Being able to keep folks in their houses should be kind of our core mission, right? And any tool we can use to do that, I think, is effective. So to answer your question, like why are we involved, or how did the treasurer get involved? It needed to, right? Necessity is a hell of a thing.
100%, 100%. So I want to open up things for questions.
Hi. Thank you. Your humor about receiving this wire on a Friday is good, but once you had this money and you're saying you spent about $500 million on these various programs, how did you administer it? Like, did your office keep the funds? Do you have a housing agency? Do you have an economic development agency? Did you work with nonprofits on aging in place programs? Like, how did you disperse that?
It's a great question. I mean, the first thing we did was we rolled around in it, right? It was great. Got it in singles. It filled a room. It was the whole thing. The second thing we did, right?
Government sounds fun.
It's Nevada. It depends on your state, right? So in Nevada, we have a very, very small government. We have the smallest governor's office number of people, not per capita, but just in the country. Right, there are 40-odd people in the Treasury, 60-ish now. There are about 3 people in the Nevada Housing Division, right? But all of you have a housing division, right? First off, there's a housing division in every state. Sometimes it's in economic development, sometimes it's in business and industry, or whatever your catch-all sort of commerce department is. And so we worked through existing programs. We tried to, the easiest thing to do with ARPA spend, as everybody knows, was to plus up things that were already happening, right? To do more of work that worked. And so we did that, right? The money that went into a program was called Home Means Nevada, which is also our state song. We could sing it later. But the money that went into that program basically just plussed up existing private activity bond cap projects, right? So they were grants that went on top of projects that had already gone through that. So we had already vetted the projects. We had a way to vet the projects. And I think that's important just from a bureaucratic speed perspective, right? The more we can take advantage of existing things and make them a little bit stronger or faster, it's so much easier than setting up new programs. Age in Place, we worked with local nonprofits. The preservation work works just like the new housing work, right? Went through that same program. And then we did a fair amount, I don't know if you've looked at any of these programs, but down payment assistance programs were helpful. And the federal guidelines on down payment assistance, the sort of where your income needs to be and what your credit score needs to be is a bit of a unicorn individual, what the house price needs to be, right? Especially as house price rising. There's not too much of it. And so we were able to expand it, but we were able to expand it in a targeted way. We were able to focus on teachers, which we have a massive shortage of, like everybody else, and medical professionals and veterans. Right? And so we were able to expand what that Venn diagram center looked like in a way that hopefully was effective.
And if I can add on specifically to the down payment part, it's important to obviously have a job, but also your credit score. Yes. And this is sort of a little bit of a different direction, if you don't mind, but that is, I think, something so important. So housing, obviously, of course, is hugely important, generational wealth. But in order to get to the starting line, you have to have a credit score. And many of our renters, particularly middle and lower income renters, don't have a credit score. And so another aspect of our investment program is working through this impact framework. And we partner with Isuzu. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with them, but they do on-time positive rental reporting to the credit agencies. Because until Isuzu, and there are similar programs, came about, your rent check is generally, I sort of hope, is likely your largest check you're paying every month. And it was never reported to a credit agency. And so we have seen across our portfolio a significant increase, and I wish I had the stats off the top of my head, but I don't, but a significant increase in new credit scores established and improved credit scores through, again, on-time rental payments. They also have a short-term loan program so that they can assist in sort of a month-to-month if you get into a car accident, if you have some sort of other emergency bill that prevents you from being able to pay your rent on time that month. They have a short-term loan program with many times with 0% interest to help you get through that blip. So that you can continue to save, you can continue to build a credit score so that you can take advantage of a down payment program and move into a home of your own and start that generational wealth program.
I think such an important point because, to your point, Zach, I think we want everyone housed, right? Housed in ways that they can actually afford and it's not a burden to their kind of income, but also it can really serve as a platform for building wealth and services and other support. And I think, to your point earlier, creating access to places where families will have better outcomes as well. So I think there's that kind of first tier problem of just getting people housed in ways that's sustainable, but then really housing can be a platform for greater economic mobility as well. I think there's a question here.
The aging in place issue is really important and interesting one. We set aside some resources to help seniors age in place in our community. But I will say I was conflicted about it because the flip side of that is that you have seniors often who are the only one in the house staying in homes longer, meaning that those houses aren't available to younger families that are looking for the starter home. And I'd love your thoughts on whether there's been any place that's figured out a way to address your concern, which is allowing for that generational wealth transfer and also avoiding the acquisition of those properties by institutional investors, which are increasingly turning home ownership properties into rental properties in a community like mine. But at the same time, free those homes up so that the multi-bedroom house can be used for a larger family. And I know this is annoying, but I have one other question, which is the rolling off of affordability. This may be a little bit unique to my city. I'm mayor of Hartford, Connecticut, a very property tax dependent city. All of those affordable deals come with tax credits. And what happens is when they're required to make a massive capital investment to maintain their affordability, they also come asking for another tax abatement. And as a result, you have a poor community that is proud to shoulder the responsibility of providing affordable housing, but pays a steep price and keeps the community poorer. And wondering whether there's anybody out there doing anything interesting on that point.
The second piece is a mess. That's all I got.
So that's really where, so we have a property here in the district that was a year 15 expiring deal, and it was the same thing. It's still in an up and coming neighborhood, and the options were not great. It was likely to go just market rate. And we were able to work with a nonprofit partner, the Washington Housing Conservancy, and with the District of Columbia to provide financing to the Conservancy to acquire the property. And there is an in-place tax abatement for nonprofit ownership in the district. So that certainly helped with the deal, but we also are able, but that's sort of where it starts and stops in terms of public funding. We didn't have to go back out to the tax credit program. We didn't have to infuse a ton of capital into it, and it's now being operated as actually going up to 80% once the tax credit is sort of officially winds down. And right now it's obviously sort of 60% and below. But so it will also actually provide additional opportunity for that neighborhood, for residents there to continue to stay with limited public resources. And so it's looking at other private developers, I think, in your area who know how to operate sort of these, vintage apartments. And yes, there is income verification, which is a whole other topic and is a big burden to sort of get you through the wind down of the tax credit program. We continue to income verify personally, but I know a lot of organizations that are investing in this don't. They just sort of base it on how sort of the rent compares to incomes. But yeah, look at some of the private developers because there is an area of expertise here and you can rely on the private sector. Not to speak for them, but.
And you should speak for them. I think it's fine. On the first question, right? I think the core question is, do we want to displace someone who's currently in a home to make room for someone else in a new home? And I would say functionally no, right? that's a very specific and difficult decision, right? And I wouldn't want to be the mayor of a small town with that problem. Sorry, but the larger question, that kind of the kernel you got to at the end there, right, which was the concept of money coming in from other places, private equity money in a lot of cases, coming in large scale and purchasing homes. In Nevada, we've actually had a problem where developments, single family home developments, were started, paid for, soup to nuts, to be rental properties, right? Owned by large private equity companies as rental properties, like from the get, right? So you're taking inventory that was going to move into the single family home space and is now in the renter space, and the renter space broadly isn't great for creating generational wealth. I'm glad that they're building the inventory, to your point, kind of supply over everything, but how do you make sure that people are actually living in these homes? It's tough, right? Because anything you do that restricts the usage of that asset is going to, by definition, move capital other places, right? And so you got a bit of a seesaw approach there. One thing we've seen has some value is putting deed restrictions for single-family usage owned by a person as a first home for some period of time. And so at least you get some time where that home or that apartment is actually controlled by a person who's living there. And then over time, of course, the market takes over. But that is a difficulty, the kind of how do we create solutions that are going to protect people, but at the same time constrict the market, knowing that the market can move capital other places. There's a lot of conversations about rent control. My argument would be rent control is a symptomatic approach as opposed to a disease approach. It almost always moves capital somewhere else because money's
Can
fungible.
confirm.
Right.
We've got time for one or two more questions.
Yep. Good morning. Marvin Pendarvis, State Representative out of South Carolina. So I've got a comment and then a two-part question. So first, really appreciate a treasurer being on the panel. I've got a good relationship with the treasurer of South Carolina, and he and I have actually worked together. We recently passed a state low-income housing tax credit similar to the federal version, and so it's had some impact, but there are unintended consequences, like the mayor pointed out, where you've got a proliferation of private investment that's come in, but also has led to the displacement in some communities. And so my question is, you talked about a lot of the federal programs that exist that municipalities and states could potentially take part of and take advantage of. Can you elaborate on that? And then secondly, has there been any conversation about reconfiguring the AMI? We know the impact that has on affordable housing, and obviously that's largely, that's federally, but that's a big factor into how we develop. And so has there been any conversation about reconfiguring that?
On the first one, I could take a second.
So you actually probably can speak to the first one a little bit better. But I can say on the AMI, actually, it's funny, I was going to take the second part. On the AMI, it's sort of interesting because we sort of work outside of the federally funded programs. That's a big sort of thought part of a big part of our thought process here. We want to see success for our residents. And in a lot of the federally funded programs, notably the low-income housing tax credit program, where you're really capped at a 60% AMI average. Well, what happens if you get a huge promotion? Should you have to leave the home that you've built? And so all of our communities are mixed income for that purpose. We're no more than 75%, depending on if we use any public dollars, we're no more than 75% affordability restricted. And that's so that there's that cliff isn't there, and residents can continue to build wealth, continue to advance in their careers, and stay in their home if they choose to, without saying, congratulations on that $50,000 promotion, but you got to go. And so I don't know if you want to talk about the federal funded.
Sure, because the affordability is based on a percent of units at the property as opposed to a specific unit being restricted.
Yes, that too. Yeah, that's a good clarification. Yeah, so it's broadly, we just at move out, we sort of look at where our current unit mix is, and then decide if that can be available to an affordable renter or if it can be a market rate renter.
So the private activity bonds through low-income tax credits, that is the biggest tool that's out there. HUD is spending a lot of time looking at the way they provide vouchers. Historically, vouchers, at least in the recent history, have been person-based, right? So you have a voucher and then you go try to find housing. It can be easier from a financing perspective if the vouchers are location-based, right? So you have a project, and in that project, some of the units are voucher units. So if someone is eligible for a voucher, they can use one of those units as opposed to trying to find, right? Which is a great way to make sure that the vouchers that are coming into your state actually go to where they're supposed to go, right? In Nevada, we've got a waiting list. It's about 2 years for individuals, bless you, who have access to those vouchers but can't actually spend them, right? And so figuring out ways that you can connect individuals with those resources, with places they can use, I think is a big opportunity on the ground. And then the last thing I'll mention is we created in the state a program to take advantage of pension capital called an infrastructure bank. So we created a state infrastructure bank. And within the regulations of that infrastructure bank, we created two things. One, the ability for us to partner with private capital from outside the state. Depending on what state you're in, you might have restrictions against the state being involved in equity deals. And so figuring out a way around that can matter. But we also did it, and we really targeted a type of capital, which was union pension capital, Taft-Hartley capital, that is specifically restricted towards deals that A, pay prevailing wage, B, are built under project labor agreements. And so by doing that, we've created sort of a virtuous cycle wherein we've partnered with a group, and I don't know if anyone ever heard of the AFL-CIO's Housing Investment Trust? Okay, you should, because they're doing some amazing work in the housing space. They're one of the largest developers and funders of affordable housing in the country. It is all built union. Some of it is affordable, big A, under 60%. Some of it's workforce. Some of it's market rate. But they're building this housing in states. And one of the ways states can partner is we can take a little bit of our money, go into that subordinate position, right? Make the deal work for them. Their money is coming from union pensions, and then union folks are building these properties, putting money into their pension, and so it creates a bit of a virtuous cycle. So their return rate is actually effectively shrunk because they are kind of getting the benefit across the board. State of Nevada is going to spend about $20 million of our money on this, and it's being paired with a $200 million investment from the AFL-CIO's Housing Investment Trust, and they will do 100 of these deals. So I encourage you, we can make introductions, but that's a good tool that isn't necessarily a federal tool, but we know that when HUD is looking at projects and those projects are creating good middle-class jobs, they're easier to get funded.
And if I can just add on the voucher point, I think that's really important, especially sort of from a private developer. So in the District of Columbia, you cannot discriminate against source of income. So we have to take vouchers. We love that because we know where the income is coming from. So I think personally, it's just good business to allow voucher holders to actually find a home. It's one thing to have a voucher, it's another to find an apartment unit. But also from the partnership with the jurisdiction, we are lucky that it's sort of a relatively smooth process with the district, but that's not true everywhere. And so making sure that the voucher payments are sort of seamless, coming on time to the property owner, is a big way to encourage acceptance of vouchers in jurisdictions where it's not required, and can really make a huge impact. And just sort of cleaning that up would be helpful.
And even in jurisdictions where it's required, it will encourage the creation of more housing that
Absolutely.
Wants those vouchers, that is going after those vouchers. See, and you're just trying to remove friction points here.
Yeah.
I think it's that overall theme of collaboration between private and public, finding those friction points, figuring out how the ways we can work together more effectively.
Absolutely.
Awesome. I think that is one more. All right.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I wish our state kept all their money and rolled around in it. Instead, they sent it back. I'm the mayor of Boise in Idaho. So a couple things. I mean, I actually am trying to figure out how we work with AFL within the constraints of state law, because we want to do more of that. And there are formula issues when it comes to LIHTC opportunities for developers in Idaho, because the formulas were built so long ago and it's not reflective of who we are today. I had a question though on NOAA preservation and the work you're doing. We are on target. We set goals. We're on target to meet like the city-engaged affordable housing with both big A and little a. We did some gap financing. The state kept $50 million that they put into gap financing for housing, so that was nice. We got one project out of that. But we're struggling to meet, like we're going to meet it, but we're behind on meeting our preservation of existing affordable housing goals. So I was wondering, I can find out more offline, like who in different regions is doing this work, because I'd love to talk. But do you is your own company managing the apartment complexes that you get, or do you find, as you say, local nonprofits, are they also the managers of this? And then are you doing more than apartment complexes? Are you purchasing mobile home parks or other things like that and looking at keeping them in trust, or just curious about the different tools that you're using?
So a few things. So first, we do primarily look at apartment complexes. Just sort of that's really what's available here in the close-in DC region. So I mentioned quickly that our primary investor are financial institutions seeking CRA credit. So we are restricted to the DC MSA. And so our primary nonprofit partner, the Washington Housing Conservancy, is sort of under this umbrella known as the Washington Housing Initiative, through which our impact pool was originally created, and so they're our primary partner. As part of standing them up, we JBG Smith provide all of the real estate services, so we do property manage, although we're looking at are we the best fit for that. But there are a ton of national providers in that space that do third-party manage on behalf of other affordable housing providers. And so but we work very closely with them. We do asset manage all of our properties. And I think, so it's interesting that you said you got one deal out of the 50 million that you all kept.
The state kept 50 and they put one deal in Goldstein.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to say, so one of our investments that we made in Maryland, we received like a $2 million soft loan, and that got the state the county a couple hundred units of committed affordability. And so it's really leveraging the private dollars. We provided, I think it was like 20 some odd % of the capital stack for that particular deal. The agency financing provided 70%. So you're really leveraging the private capital that's out there for not only the nonprofits, but then also for public dollars as well. And I might have forgotten another question. Oh, who's doing this in other jurisdictions? Not enough people, quite honestly. And that's sort of why we're out here as often as we can talking about it. So I'd love to chat. And if you know of any sort of high quality developers in your jurisdiction, in your city, that you think would be great for this, we're happy to talk to them. Again, we're sort of focused right now on the DC Metro. We are looking at going up and down sort of the southeastern seaboard and expanding our platform, which was part of our rebrand away from just Washington. But we hope that other jurisdictions copy this because we think it's been so successful here, and it's definitely replicable in other areas.
Well, I want to thank Zach and Lily for their time and thank everyone for the great questions.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.